Shabbat shalom, everyone. You may be seated. One of the more potent and dramatic moments in all of the Torah is described at the very first words in the portion which we read today. Moses has a brother named Aaron. And Aaron has two sons. Their names are Nadav and Avihu. And they offered a strange fire to God. Now, we don't know if they offered that strange fire because they were thinking outside the box. We don't know if they offered that strange fire because they were being disrespectful. We don't know if it was out of zealotry or they just didn't understand how it was that one was supposed to offer sacrifices. But we do know that it made God mad. So mad that God took away Nadav and Avihu's life. He zapped them up from the earth. They died instantly. And the powerful and potent, dramatic moment is more than that death. It's the response of a grieving father. The text tells us not that Aaron cried, not that he screamed, not that he rebelled, not that he showed anger to God. Rather, Vayidom Aharon. Aaron was absolutely silent. As a rabbi, when I have dealt with the most tragic situations in people's lives, often I find that the only atmosphere that is appropriate in those painful moments is one of absolute silence. There often aren't words to bring consolation or remedies or explanations, just moments of silence. But Jews and people as a whole do not do so well with silence. We like to fill those voids with words and with talking. We have a Jewish custom that we wash our hands before we make the Hamotzi prayer. And the tradition tells us that from the moment we wash our hands and say the prayer over washing our hands, until we say the blessing over bread, we are supposed to be silent. And go into any observant household that fulfills this custom, and you will see uneasiness. You will see people who squirm in their seat, who hum, who try to do funny things in sign language, explaining one thing to the next, because they have problems with just those moments of silence. Now, silence in our tradition can be a really good thing, and silence in our tradition can be a really bad thing. And I would argue that as Jews and as humans, we have missed the mark on where and when we should be silent and where and when we should not be silent. There have been times, like in tragedy, times in moments of peril, times in upset, where the world has required us to accept the moment with silence, and not punditry, and not response, and not reaction, but just to be like Aaron, Vayidom Aharon, and to be silent. And there have been moments around the globe where we have seen atrocities and pain and hurt. And too often, we have leaned on the side of silence when the world has needed advocacy, when the world has needed our voice and our feet and our bodies to stand loudly and proudly. In the book of Esther, Mordecai, who is Esther's uncle, says very specifically to her in chapter 4, when there has been laid out a plan by the evil Haman to destroy all of the Jewish people, Mordecai says to his niece, listen, if you stay silent, someone else will have to rise to the occasion. And if you stay silent, then the blood of these people will be on your hands. Maybe this is the moment that you came to this place for. That's it. That's a moment where Mordecai is telling Esther, use your voice. It's not a time for you to be silent. Silent is what happened after that tragedy would occur, not before. And we see that behavior in another example that's really quite beautiful. An example in the book of Genesis, chapter 18, where 3 men leave the tent of Abraham and Sarah and make their way east towards Sodom and Gomorrah, towards Sodom and Gomorrah. And God says, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And what does Abraham do? Abraham cries out for the injustice that is about to happen. You're going to destroy the world, God? You're going to wipe out all of these good people? You're going to take the innocent and take them away with those who have done wrong? And Abraham begins the process of negotiation and says, if we find 50 and then 40 and 30 and 20 and down to 10 righteous people, do not forsake them and destroy them. Abraham knew it wasn't a time to be silent. And perhaps the best and most modern example of someone who reminded us of the perils of silence at the wrong time was the late and great Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel of blessed memory. Elie Wiesel said on numerous occasions, you cannot be silent. Silent is indifference, and indifference is the enemy. Do you realize the courage it must have taken Wiesel to stand in the East Room, in the White House, and to say in the most respectful way possible to then President Ronald Reagan, Mr. President, you do not belong in Bitburg in an SS cemetery. It is not the place for you. He didn't want to go to bed that day or in his legacy with not using his voice, even talking before the equivalent of kings. He knew what it was to have advocacy. He knew what it was to not be silent. And with all of that in mind, I have an important question for you. And I want you to raise your hands if you feel this way, and I'll try hard not to judge you by your answer. Who here thinks that the United States should send troops to the Ukraine to defend it from the invasion against Russia? Okay. Probably, based on the numbers of you, and I appreciate your honesty, less than 10% of you. Now, of those of you that raised your hand, how many of you would be willing to have your children or grandchildren go off to do that defending? So only 2 of you who had raised your hand before, or 3, okay? Why do I bring that up? I bring that up because this past week, just a couple days ago, we commemorated Yom HaShoah U'Gvura, the day of Holocaust remembrance and heroism. A day that was chosen out of all of the days in the year as Jews when we celebrate, not as an international community, because it was the time of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, a time that represented our strength and resilience in the time of such peril. And if ever there was a parallel in my lifetime between that which happened in September 1st, 1939, when Adolf Hitler invaded Poland with the hopes of taking over all of Europe, and his goal at the invasion in 1939, bear in mind, was not to kill all the Jews. It might have been an ancillary goal, but it wasn't his goal. His goal was to take over Europe at that time. If ever I saw a parallel, it is in the invasion of Ukraine by Vladimir Putin. And while I have never met Vladimir Putin, I've never been inside his head, and I don't know what he's thinking, my guess is he's not going to be satisfied with just Ukraine. That he will want to go up to where that Iron Curtain was once drawn in the 80s and reclaim all of what was once known as the empire of the former Soviet Union, with Moldova and Poland and Bulgaria and Belarus and the likes. Now, how many of us have used the words, never again? How many of us have lit candles this last week that were yellow and said, never again? How many of us have watched the horrible stories from the Holocaust and remind ourselves and our children, we tell them these stories because never again? And I say this lovingly because I probably would vote like most of you. So do not take this as a fierce chastisement. Less than 10% of this room is willing to have our troops go and defend against what is happening again. Why is that? We say never again, but as a whole, we were not leading the charge in Bosnia. We say never again, and as a whole, and a people, we were not on the platforms denouncing what was happening in Rwanda. And we say never again, and 1 million people have been slaughtered in Syria. And we say never again, and it's happening again right now in Ukraine. The war happens in Ukraine a little over a month ago, and probably without exaggeration, 250 emails and notifications on social media pop into my register and tell me about people's familial lineage that links them to towns in the Ukraine. Maybe it's areas in Mizirich, maybe it's in Lvov, maybe it's in Kiev, maybe it's in Odessa. My grandfather, my great-grandfather, my aunt, my uncle, all of these pieces of their genetic history come down from these lines in Ukraine. And lovingly, those same people, when asked, would you be willing to fight, to go and protect the people of Ukraine? Oh, we just came out of 2 long wars. It cost this country a lot. We lost a lot of people. What do we have to show for Afghanistan and Iraq? We're going to go to Ukraine now? We're going to fight other people's wars, I hear? I have a 15-year-old boy. I'm not eager at the idea of him signing up to go to war either. So I hear you, and I understand you. What I'm merely pointing out to all of us is the level of hypocrisy that you and I are responsible for. When we light candles and we remember the Holocaust and we declare never again, while it is happening again and again around us. And we are like Aaron, but in the wrong way, we are silent. And there is a time to be silent, and there is a time to use our voices. And I would argue that this is a time to use our voices and to not be silent. If we are a people that said, how could the world have stood silently while the atrocities of the Jews happened throughout Europe from 1939 to 1945, and at the same time, you would not be willing to open your home right now to a family who is part of the refugee crisis. Or at the same time, you're going to fetch that the price of gasoline is up $1 or $2 as a result of this war. Then I ask you, do you really have the right to complain about those who stood silent when we are behaving just like them? And maybe the answers are greater and more opportunistic than just going off to war. There are many other avenues and roads we can take beyond sending our men and women into Ukraine. We can increase aid to the Ukraine. We can offer them support through NATO. We can offer them support through military aid. We can open our homes to those who are refugees in the crisis. We can volunteer with the new system that has just been opened up by the government that allows us to be sponsors for those who are coming over. We can find those who have come over, and we can volunteer times, energy, services for all of the ways in which they need. And those are ways in which we are no longer silent. And that blunts the hypocrisy of saying never again and doing nothing when it happens again. I remember the very first time that I had gone to Poland. The year was 1996. I had visited all of the camps that I could at the time: Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdanek, Auschwitz, Birkenau, Belzec. And since then have visited many more. I've been to Poland 17 other times. And I remember walking through Majdanek in particular. The most scary thing about Majdanek is that it could be a functioning camp again within 36 hours. It was left as it was found, basically. And I walked through what was called Canada, which are storerooms about the size of maybe half of this sanctuary. And I went through storerooms of shoes where you could smell the horrible leather rotting. I went through storerooms of glasses piled 5 feet high of people's glasses that were reading glasses that were just collected. Storerooms of clothing and dolls. And that was a moment where the words of Aaron, or perhaps the lack of words of Aaron, resonated with me. Vayidom Aaron, I was silent. There was nothing to say, nothing to respond. There was no gesture I could even make. It was a moment to process. And the world has had many moments since where we can follow in Aaron's footsteps. But there are other moments that require our action, that don't ask for our passivity, but rather our passion, that don't ask for us to be on the sideline, but rather to get into the game. And it is not a black or white option of choosing send our troops off to war or not. There are 12 to 20 other options of things we all can do. And if you don't know what to do, call me up. Call up someone else in our community who's been involved, because I promise you there are things to do, including talking to our legislators about allowing more refugees in, providing more aid, both medical and humanitarian, that's necessary, reopening the border with Mexico for refugees from the Ukraine so that they can come through without a visa. And the list goes on. But how will history judge us if we stay silent while claiming never again? When we light the candle to remember the 6 million, the greatest oath we can make in their memory is not only words, but actions that represent those words. All of us have work to do. All of us have a responsibility to live towards and to upkeep. Let us not use this as a time of shock and silence. Let us not use this as a time of passivity. Let us hear that call, stand tall, stand loud, and to use our voices to shape a world that is worthy of giving to our children so that we never have to say never again, and no one has to wonder where we were in these times of peril. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may that be God's will, and let us say amen.